terrifying encounters with aliens in cornfields. The rustle of corn stalks was deafening in the stillness of the night, but it wasn't the wind. It was something moving, something alive. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he stumbled through the field, his breath hitching when he heard the guttural, wet sound of something breathing right behind him. He froze. A metallic clicking noise echoed, sharp and deliberate. Slowly he turned his head, and that's when he saw them. Black, lidless eyes staring back from the shadows, unblinking. If you're enjoying this spine-chilling story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to never miss another terrifying tale. The silence was heavy, oppressive, almost alive. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came from peace or serenity. It was a void, an absence of life, the type of stillness that made the hair on the back of your neck prickle with an instinctual warning. Ethan and Claire stood at the edge of the cornfield, the darkness pressing against them like an unseen predator, daring them to take a step further. Ethan clenched his flashlight, the beam weak and flickering, as if the darkness itself were swallowing the light. Claire, always the more skeptical of the two, tried to laugh off the unease tightening her chest. "It's just corn," she muttered under her breath, but even she could hear the lie in her own voice. The rows of corn stood tall and imposing, their stalks unnaturally straight, almost too perfect, like soldiers standing at attention. Each leaf seemed razor-sharp, catching the faint breeze and slicing through the silence with a subtle hiss. They had come here on a dare, a challenge from their friends who believed the stories about the cornfield were nothing more than small-town folklore. But now, standing there, the weight of those stories pressed against them, colder than the night air. Tales of strange lights flickering in the sky, eerie hums vibrating through the ground, and most chilling of all, people vanishing without a trace. Ethan took the first step, his sneaker crunching on the dry dirt path that led into the heart of the field. The sound seemed deafening, echoing far louder than it should have, as if the corn itself were amplifying every noise. Claire hesitated, her stomach twisting in knots, but she followed him. The air was thick, suffocating, and carried an acrid metallic scent that burned her nostrils. "Do you smell that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to admit it, but the smell reminded him of rusted metal and something else, something rancid and decaying. As they ventured deeper, the world around them began to shift. The rows of corn closed in, narrowing the path until they were forced to walk single file. The moonlight, which had seemed so bright at the edge of the field, was now almost non-existent, swallowed by the towering stalks. Shadows danced in their peripheral vision, darting between the rows, but every time they turned to look, there was nothing there. Claire gripped Ethan's arm tightly, her fingernails digging into his skin. "I don't like this," she whispered, her breath shaky. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Then came the sound. It started faintly, almost imperceptible, like the ticking of a distant clock. Click, click, click. The noise was rhythmic, deliberate, and it sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, shining his flashlight toward the source, but the beam was swallowed by the endless rows of corn. The clicking grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from all directions. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't an animal, or the rustling of the corn in the breeze. It was something else entirely, something deliberate. Claire's grip on Ethan's arm tightened as the clicking was joined by another sound. Whispers. They were faint at first, indistinct, but as they strained to listen, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The voices overlapped, speaking in a language neither of them could understand. It wasn't just the sound of the words that terrified them, it was the tone. The whispers weren't frantic or hurried. They were calm, methodical, and filled with an eerie sense of purpose. Claire's breath hitched, her chest tightening as the whispers seemed to wrap around her like invisible tendrils, burrowing into her mind. Ethan turned to her, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "It's just the wind," he said, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. He didn't believe his own words, and neither did Claire. The whispers were too distinct, too intentional to be dismissed as wind. The clicking and whispering merged into an unsettling symphony that seemed to seep into their bones. Every instinct screamed at them to turn back, to run, but the path behind them had disappeared. The rows of corn were no longer rows. They were walls, towering and impenetrable, boxing them in like prey. The air grew colder, the metallic scent more pungent, making them gag. Claire reached out to touch one of the corn stalks, desperate to ground herself. But the moment her fingers brushed against it, she recoiled with a gasp. The leaf was wet and sticky, coated in a dark, viscous substance that glistened under the weak flashlight. She held up her hand and her stomach churned as she realized it was blood. "Ethan," she choked, showing him her trembling hand. Before he could respond, the clicking noise stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, more terrifying than the sound itself. And then, from deep within the field, came the first scream. It wasn't human. It was guttural, raw, and filled with a pain so profound it made their skin crawl. Ethan's flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering as the scream was followed by a low, droning hum that vibrated through the ground. They froze, their bodies paralyzed with fear as the cornfield seemed to shift and pulse around them. The whispers returned, louder this time, and with them came an overwhelming sense of dread. They weren't alone. Something was watching them, something that didn't belong in this world. Ethan grabbed Claire's hand, his voice shaking as he whispered, "We need to get out of here, now." But deep down, they both knew there was no way out. The cornfield was alive, and it had no intention of letting them leave. Ethan's hand trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen glowing faintly before flickering out altogether. He tried to restart it, his thumb frantic against the power button, but it was useless. Claire did the same, her face illuminated briefly by the blue glow before her phone went dark as well. "No signal," she whispered, her voice cracking with the edge of panic she was trying desperately to suppress. The realization hit them both at the same time. They were cut off. The comforting lifeline of technology, the ability to call for help or even light their path, was gone, swallowed by the oppressive field that surrounded them. "Let's keep moving," Ethan muttered, trying to sound braver than he felt. His voice was shaky, hollow, as if the field itself had drained the confidence from him. They pressed on, their footsteps crunching against the dry, brittle dirt. The rows of corn seemed to stretch endlessly, each stalk a carbon copy of the last. It was disorienting, like they were trapped in some kind of looping nightmare where every step forward only led them deeper into the labyrinth. Claire kept looking back over her shoulder, convinced she could hear something following them, though every time she turned, all she saw was the wall of corn, swaying gently in a wind she couldn't feel. The whispers returned, faint at first, just a trickle of sound that could almost be mistaken for the natural rustling of leaves. But they grew louder, more distinct, each syllable sharp and cutting, like a knife dragging across glass. Claire stopped walking, her body rigid, her eyes wide. "Ethan, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. Ethan nodded, but didn't turn to look at her. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line as he strained to make sense of the sound. The whispers were overlapping now, coming from all directions, and though the words were incomprehensible, their tone carried a sinister clarity. Whatever was speaking didn't belong here, and it wanted them to know that. The further they walked, the heavier the air became. It clung to their skin like a second layer, damp and suffocating. The smell was stronger now, that same metallic tang mixed with something else, a sickly sweet odor that turned their stomachs. Claire gagged, pressing the sleeve of her hoodie over her nose, but it didn't help. The scent seemed to seep into her lungs, making her chest tighten with each breath. "What is that?" she asked, but Ethan didn't answer. He was staring ahead, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Up ahead, the path forked, splitting into two identical routes. The beam of Ethan's flashlight wavered as he scanned both options, each one looking as uninviting as the other. The corn loomed higher here, the stalks nearly brushing against each other, creating an almost claustrophobic tunnel. "Which way?" Claire asked, her voice quivering. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. Logic told him it didn't matter. They were lost, and no direction would lead them out. But something about the left path made his skin crawl. The whispers seemed louder there, the shadows darker. "Right," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his gut. As they took their first step onto the new path, the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped sharply, the chill biting into their skin despite their layers of clothing. Claire shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's freezing," she murmured, her breath visible in the sudden cold. Ethan didn't respond. His focus was on the flashlight, which was starting to flicker again. He shook it, muttering a curse under his breath. When the light stabilized, Claire stopped walking, grabbing his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Do you see that?" Ethan followed her gaze, his stomach sinking. Ahead, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It stood motionless in the middle of the path, its silhouette tall and unnaturally thin. At first, Ethan thought it might be a scarecrow, but something about the way it stood, its limbs slightly too long, its posture unnervingly rigid, felt wrong. The flashlight beam caught its face, and both Ethan and Claire gasped. It wasn't a face at all. Where its eyes should have been, there were deep, hollow sockets, and its mouth was a jagged line that stretched unnaturally wide, as though it had been carved into its skull. The skin was pale and leathery, mottled with patches of something that looked like mold. "Is that a scarecrow?" Claire asked, her voice shaking as she took a step back. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to rationalize what he was seeing, but no explanation came. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, but the whispers were louder now, almost deafening, as if they were coming directly from it. Before they could decide what to do, the flashlight flickered again, plunging them into darkness for a split second. When the light returned, the figure was gone. Ethan stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where did it go?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own breathing. Ethan shook his head, his hands trembling as he scanned the path ahead with the flashlight. The cornfield was empty, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. The whispers shifted, transforming into a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second, resonating deep in their bones. Claire grabbed Ethan's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to leave," she said, her voice firm despite the terror in her eyes. But Ethan didn't move. He was frozen, his gaze locked on something in the distance. A faint blue light appeared, flickering in and out of existence like a firefly in the night. It hovered just above the ground, pulsing softly, and with each pulse, the hum grew louder. The light began to move, weaving between the stalks of corn as if it was searching for something, or someone. Ethan and Claire watched in horror as the light grew brighter, closer, until it was almost blinding. Ethan grabbed Claire's hand, pulling her back down the path. "Run," he whispered, his voice trembling. And as they turned to flee, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the field. The sound wasn't human, at least not entirely. It carried a distorted, animalistic quality, a guttural resonance that vibrated deep in Ethan and Claire's chests, setting their nerves alight with primal fear. It rose and fell in uneven pitches, as if multiple voices were layered into one unholy cry. It wasn't just a noise, it was a violation, a sound that wormed its way into the very core of their beings, leaving them gasping for air. Claire clutched Ethan's arm so tightly her nails bit into his skin, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. His legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the sound. The scream reverberated through the cornfield, and as it faded, the oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. The stillness wasn't natural. It was loaded with an electric tension, as if the very air around them was holding its breath. Claire turned to Ethan, her eyes wide and glistening with tears she hadn't even realized were falling. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer. He was staring into the darkness ahead, his flashlight beam quivering as his hands shook uncontrollably. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could he explain the inexplicable? The cornfield had changed. It wasn't just a maze of towering stalks anymore. It felt alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. The rows of corn appeared to shift subtly, the shadows between them deepening into impenetrable voids. The whispers returned, faint at first, like distant voices carried on the wind, but they grew louder, more insistent, each syllable sharp and alien. Claire wiped her face with trembling hands, trying to compose herself, but the whispers were drilling into her mind, relentless and invasive. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, the dirt crunching beneath his feet. The sound felt deafening in the suffocating quiet, like a thunderclap in a cathedral. Claire grabbed his arm. "Ethan, don't," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't stop. His instincts screamed at him to run, to turn back, but something stronger was pulling him forward. A dark, inexplicable compulsion, as if the cornfield itself was drawing him deeper into its embrace. "We can't just stand here," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. As they moved forward, the cold grew unbearable. It wasn't the natural chill of a crisp autumn night. It was an unnatural, bone-deep cold that seemed to radiate from the ground itself. Every breath came out in frosty clouds, and their skin prickled with the icy touch of the air. Claire shivered violently, her teeth chattering as she wrapped her arms around herself. "It's too cold," she said, her voice cracking. Ethan nodded, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The blue light appeared again, faint and distant, flickering like a dying ember. But this time, it wasn't alone. More lights began to emerge, glowing faintly at first, then intensifying until they cast an eerie, otherworldly glow over the cornfield. They moved in erratic patterns, weaving between the stalks like fireflies on a demented path. Claire watched in horror as one of the lights passed close to her, illuminating the corn in a pale, sickly hue. The stalks weren't just corn anymore. They were coated in a slick, viscous substance that shimmered under the strange light. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against the stalk, and recoiled with a gasp. Her hand came away sticky, coated in a dark, tar-like residue that smelled of rot and iron. "What is this?" she cried, showing her hand to Ethan. He shook his head, his face pale and glistening with sweat despite the freezing cold. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice hollow. He shone his flashlight on one of the stalks, and his stomach turned as he realized the substance wasn't just on the corn. It was seeping from it, oozing like blood from an open wound. The sight was nauseating, but they didn't have time to dwell on it. The hum returned, low and rhythmic, vibrating through the ground like the heartbeat of some colossal, unseen entity. It was stronger now, more intense, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ethan and Claire stumbled forward, their steps unsteady as the vibrations threw them off balance. The lights grew brighter, converging ahead of them into a pulsating mass of blue and white that seemed to defy all logic. As they approached, the whispers reached a crescendo, overlapping into a cacophony of sound that threatened to split their minds in two. Claire clapped her hands over her ears, screaming in agony, but the noise didn't stop. It was inside her head, burrowing deep into her thoughts, filling her mind with fragmented images she couldn't comprehend, shadows moving in unnatural ways, faces with too many eyes, hands reaching out from impossible angles. She fell to her knees, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Make it stop," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Ethan dropped beside her, his hands trembling as he tried to pull her up. "We have to keep moving," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. But as he turned to face the light, his words caught in his throat. The mass of glowing orbs had taken on a shape, vaguely humanoid, but horribly wrong. It stood taller than any human, its limbs elongated and twisting unnaturally. Its head tilted to one side, as if studying them, and its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness with an intensity that made Ethan's chest tighten. The creature didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a deafening stillness that made Ethan's ears ring. The creature raised one long, spindly arm, pointing directly at them. Ethan felt his body lock up, his muscles refusing to obey him. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the creature's gaze bored into him. Claire whimpered beside him, her hands trembling as she clung to his arm. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The creature tilted its head further, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Then, without warning, it let out a sound, a deep, resonant hum that shook the ground beneath them. The cornfield seemed to come alive, the stalks twisting and writhing like living things. The blue light intensified, blinding them, and Ethan felt a searing pain in his chest, as if something was being ripped from him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The light vanished, the hum faded, and the cornfield was silent once more. Ethan and Claire lay on the ground, gasping for air, their bodies trembling. They didn't speak. They couldn't. The terror was too fresh, too raw. But as they struggled to their feet, they realized something was wrong. The path they had been following was gone, replaced by an endless sea of corn that stretched in every direction. They were trapped, and whatever had brought them here wasn't finished with them yet. The cornfield loomed around them, an endless labyrinth of shadows and whispers. No longer just a field of crops, it had transformed into something alive, something sentient and deeply malevolent. The corn stalks swayed faintly, not from wind, there was none, but as though they were breathing, expanding and contracting with a silent rhythm. Each shift in the stalks brought a faint, nauseating rustle, like paper crumpling in slow motion. It was a sound that clawed at their nerves, setting their teeth on edge. Ethan's flashlight beam jittered as his hand trembled, the light barely penetrating the suffocating darkness. "Where do we go?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Her words barely rose above a whisper, as though speaking any louder would invoke the attention of something lurking in the shadows. Her eyes darted around, searching for any semblance of a path, but all she could see were the endlessly shifting walls of corn. The residue she had touched earlier still clung to her fingers, now sticky and foul-smelling, as though it had seeped into her skin. She scrubbed her hand against her jeans, desperate to rid herself of the sensation, but it was no use. The substance felt alive, writhing under her skin like worms. Ethan didn't respond. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting instincts, fight, flight, or freeze, but none seemed viable in the face of the incomprehensible terror surrounding them. His chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, and his pulse thundered in his ears. He gripped Claire's arm, not to comfort her, but to ground himself, as though her presence could tether him to reality. We keep moving," he muttered finally, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. He took a tentative step forward, dragging Claire with him. Each step felt like an eternity. The ground beneath them was no longer just dirt, but a soft, uneven surface that seemed to shift slightly under their weight. It gave the unsettling impression of walking on flesh, warm and pliable. With every step, faint tremors rippled through the ground, as though something massive stirred just beneath the surface. Claire gasped as her foot sank slightly into the earth, and she yanked it back, staring down in horror. The ground where she had stepped pulsed faintly, a sickly red light emanating from beneath the soil before fading into darkness. "What the hell is this?" she cried, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. Ethan shook his head, his jaw clenched tightly. He didn't have an answer. How could he? This wasn't reality. It couldn't be. But the cold air biting at his skin and the stench of rot in his nostrils told him otherwise. Whatever this was, it was real. Too real. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct than before. They weren't just random murmurs now. They were words. Alien, guttural words spoken in a language that defied comprehension. The voices overlapped, creating a chaotic symphony of sound that made Ethan and Claire clutch their heads in agony. It wasn't just noise, it was invasive, crawling into their minds like needles, prodding at their thoughts and memories. Images flashed in their minds, horrifying and nonsensical, a sky filled with 3 suns, a vast, undulating sea of black ooze, and figures with too many limbs moving in impossible ways. Claire fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. I can't take it," she cried, her voice raw and desperate. Ethan dropped beside her, pulling her close as though his embrace could shield her from the horrors surrounding them. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until they were all-consuming. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block them out, but the images only grew stronger, more vivid. He saw Claire's face, twisted and malformed, her eyes replaced with glowing orbs of light. He saw his own hands, dripping with that black, tar-like substance, as though he were becoming part of the field itself. Suddenly the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Ethan and Claire opened their eyes cautiously, their breaths coming in short gasps. The darkness around them felt heavier now, more oppressive. The cornstalks stood unnaturally still, as though frozen in time. And then, slowly, the ground began to shake. It started as a faint tremor, barely noticeable, but quickly escalated into violent vibrations that threw them off balance. The cornstalks swayed wildly, their tops snapping against each other with a sound like cracking bones. Ethan struggled to his feet, pulling Claire up with him. "Run!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. He didn't know where they were running to. There was no path, no visible escape, but staying still wasn't an option. They stumbled forward, the uneven ground threatening to trip them with every step. The air grew colder still, so cold that it burned their lungs with each breath. Behind them, a new sound emerged, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. It was deep and resonant, vibrating through the air like the rumble of a distant thunderstorm. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, and his heart nearly stopped. A shadow was moving through the corn, massive and hulking, its shape indistinct but undeniably inhuman. It moved with an unnatural grace, its movements too smooth, too fluid, like a predator stalking its prey. The growl grew louder, joined by the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps. The ground trembled with each step, the vibrations rattling Ethan and Claire's bones. Claire screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound that echoed through the cornfield, but it did nothing to deter the creature. The shadow drew closer, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its head was elongated, tapering to a sharp point, and its glowing eyes burned like twin stars in the darkness. Ethan and Claire ran faster, their breaths ragged and their muscles screaming in protest. The cornstalks whipped against their faces and arms, leaving thin, stinging cuts. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. The creature was gaining on them, its footsteps growing louder, more insistent. Ethan's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into complete darkness. Claire cried out in terror, clutching his arm as they stumbled blindly through the field. Ahead of them, a faint light appeared, soft and golden, a stark contrast to the cold blue lights they had seen before. It flickered like a flame, casting dancing shadows on the corn. "There!" Ethan shouted, his voice filled with a desperate hope. They veered toward the light, their legs burning with exertion. The growl behind them grew louder still, now accompanied by a guttural, clicking sound that made their skin crawl. As they neared the light, its source became clear. A lantern, hanging from a wooden post in the middle of a small clearing. But the sight that awaited them in the clearing was far from comforting. The ground was littered with strange symbols, carved deeply into the earth and glowing faintly with an eerie red light. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. The figure turned slowly to face them, and the lantern's light illuminated its features, or lack thereof. Its face was smooth, devoid of any features save for 2 glowing, hollow eyes. Ethan and Claire froze, their bodies trembling with fear. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at them, and the growling behind them ceased. The silence was absolute, suffocating. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, the figure spoke a single word: "Stay." The figure's voice was a haunting paradox, both deafening and barely audible, a sound that resonated not in the ears but deep in the mind. It clawed at their thoughts, tearing through reason and embedding itself like a parasite. Ethan's breath hitched, his chest rising and falling as though the very air around him had turned to lead. Claire, trembling violently, clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin with desperate intensity. The figure's glowing eyes bored into them, twin abysses that seemed to strip away their very sense of self. Ethan could feel something, no, someone, pressing into his consciousness, prying into his thoughts as if flipping through the pages of a book. The clearing around them, illuminated by the faint glow of the carved symbols in the dirt, seemed to pulse in time with their racing heartbeats. The air was thick and heavy, charged with an unnatural energy that made every hair on their bodies stand on end. The lantern hanging from the wooden post flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the clearing like specters. The symbols carved into the ground emitted a low hum, a deep vibration that Ethan could feel in his bones. It was as if the very earth beneath them was alive, quivering with anticipation, waiting for something unspeakable to happen. The figure in the center of the clearing didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, a gravitational pull that threatened to drag them into an abyss they couldn't comprehend. Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the rational part of his brain was drowning under the weight of pure, unadulterated terror. This wasn't just fear, it was annihilation. The complete obliteration of everything he understood about reality. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan's voice cracked as he forced the words out, his throat dry and raw. His question hung in the air, unanswered, as the figure tilted its head ever so slightly, a motion that seemed almost curious, almost human, but not quite. The subtle movement sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through Ethan's veins. And then, the figure raised its arm. The motion was slow, deliberate, as though it were savoring the moment. Its elongated, spindly fingers extended toward them, impossibly long and unnaturally jointed. Claire whimpered, her grip on Ethan tightening as the figure's hand hovered in the air, pointing directly at them. The carved symbols on the ground flared brighter, their glow intensifying until it burned into their retinas. The hum grew louder, transforming into a deafening roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ethan staggered backward, pulling Claire with him, but it was as if the air had turned solid around them, trapping them in place. Each step was a monumental effort, as though they were wading through quicksand. "We have to go," Claire screamed, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. But there was nowhere to go. The cornfield surrounded them on all sides, an impenetrable wall of darkness, and the figure blocked their only visible path. As the figure's hand lowered, the ground beneath their feet began to shift. The dirt rippled like water, and the symbols carved into the earth twisted and reformed, their shapes morphing into something more complex, more sinister. The red light emanating from the symbols deepened, taking on a sickly, pulsating quality. It wasn't just light. It was alive, writhing and slithering like a nest of serpents. Ethan and Claire could feel its heat against their skin, a burning, searing sensation that made them cry out in pain. Suddenly, the earth split open. A jagged crack tore through the clearing, releasing a burst of foul-smelling air that reeked of decay and sulfur. The crack widened, revealing a chasm that descended into infinite darkness. From the depths of the chasm came a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground and into their very bones. It was a sound that defied logic, a primal, otherworldly noise that spoke of hunger and malice. Ethan and Claire clung to each other, their eyes fixed on the chasm as a shape began to emerge. It was massive, far larger than anything they could have imagined, and its form was indistinct, constantly shifting as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Limbs sprouted and retracted, heads formed and dissolved, and eyes, countless glowing eyes, blinked open and shut across its surface. It was a creature born of nightmares, a being that existed outside the boundaries of reality. Claire screamed, a sound of pure, unfiltered terror, as the creature's many eyes fixed on them. Each eye seemed to see straight through them, peeling back the layers of their minds and exposing their deepest fears. Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his head as the creature's gaze invaded his thoughts. He saw visions of himself and Claire, trapped in the cornfield, their bodies twisted and deformed, their minds lost to madness. He saw the creature devouring them, consuming not just their flesh but their very souls. The figure in the clearing stepped forward, its movements impossibly smooth, as though it were gliding rather than walking. It stood at the edge of the chasm, its featureless face turned toward the creature. Slowly it raised its arms, and the creature responded, its shifting form writhing with anticipation. Ethan and Claire could only watch in horror as the figure began to chant, its voice a guttural alien sound that resonated deep within their minds. The symbols on the ground flared brighter than ever, their light blinding. The creature roared, a sound so loud it made the ground quake and the air vibrate. Ethan and Claire clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces as the light consumed everything. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. The clearing was plunged into darkness, the only sound their ragged breathing. When they opened their eyes, the figure was gone. The chasm had sealed itself, leaving no trace of its existence. But the cornfield remained, its oppressive walls closing in around them. Ethan and Claire stumbled to their feet, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Together they turned and began to walk, their only goal to escape the nightmare they had found themselves in. But deep down, they both knew the truth. The cornfield wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it would never let them go. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you're completely alone? Because in fields like these, the watchers never leave.